Hi. So on this video, I'm going to be talking about what normalizing is and about what it's good for. So I would say the very essence of normalizing is keeping your cool in your center and helping other people keep their cool and find their center, even in the face of pretty weird experiences. And a lot of the way that is done is noticing that the way those experiences aren't as weird or impossible to understand as they seem to be, just looking at them on face value. Or if we just focus on what's abnormal about them. um, Normalizing is about also noticing what is understandable about them or how they fit in with more regular kinds of experiences. So first, to get an idea of what we're talking about in normalizing, let me describe some of the basic components of that kind of approach. So one key part of it is pointing out how the kinds of experiences that get called psychotic are really not uncommon in the population as a whole. So we might look at the relative frequency of experiences like people hearing voices or of people having beliefs that psychiatrists think are delusional. Another key aspect of normalizing is helping people be aware of all the different kinds of situations and issues that can cause psychotic kinds of experiences. And those range from things like lack of sleep to being isolated, experiencing a lot of stress and trauma, having internal conflicts. Drug use can definitely lead to a lot of psychotic experiences. Bereavement is another common cause. So understanding this kind of thing helps people see their psychotic experiences as possibly grounded in their everyday experiences, which in turn helps them deal with those experiences often in a much more grounded manner. And so related to that is helping people see how their difficulties with psychotic experiences are similar to difficulties with other kinds of mental and emotional issues like panic or excess worry, self-critical thoughts, depressed mood, troublesome memories that emerge when you don't want them to. And then another part of normalizing that is especially important is noticing how many people actually do cope with psychotic experiences successfully, or even find them useful in certain ways. Um, so we might ask, like, what's normalizing good for? Why would it be so important to learn it? A key advantage is that it tends to lower the fear and the negative arousal that goes along with extreme experiences. And that fear and negative arousal is important to lower because in itself, it tends to lead to more difficult or extreme psychotic experiences. It also makes people more preoccupied with the experiences they're having. And then on the other hand, it also makes people often engage in excessive avoidance of the experience or attempts to avoid the experience that end up backfiring. I could just go through one quick example. Let's say you have a person who, for various reasons, maybe starts feeling persecuted, but then they worry that their sense of persecution is kind of getting out of hand, and maybe it means they're going crazy. And the concept of going crazy seems totally horrible and unthinkable to them. But then maybe they kind of like learn that it's possible to avoid feeling crazy if they just focus on reasons to think that the persecution is real. So in other words, if they can convince themselves the persecution is real, then they're not crazy and they don't have to feel crazy. But that makes them less willing to look at evidence that it might not be real. And then as a result of not being willing to look at that evidence and being really locked into their belief about being persecuted, they're actually acting more crazy and getting into more trouble. So normalizing to people being paranoid at times, that, hey, you know, it's kind of common to be paranoid at times. Sometimes it's even justified. Helps people look at that with more of an open mind. It helps people maybe be willing to look at, well, what is the evidence that for them possibly being persecuted or not in their individual case and situation. With all that said, I should mention that there's also times when people are holding so firmly to what seems to be a delusional belief that there isn't much of an opening for normalizing. And I'll get into the particulars of how to make progress in those kind of cases in a separate module on working with delusions or beliefs that seem to be delusional. Now, another advantage of normalizing is it can help in reducing what we might call stigma, or particularly self-stigma, which involves negative judgments that the person directs at themselves for being mad or mentally ill or however it's being thought of. If instead it seemed to be normal to be a little crazy at times and more crazy at more extreme and tricky times, then the person's self-judgment might become less intense. And normalizing can also be used within family work to improve understanding and reduce stigma and discrimination at that level. So another advantage of normalizing is that it can sometimes help people come up with culturally acceptable interpretations for their experiences. In other words, they're having some kind of like weird experiences, but they've interpreted them the way that the culture doesn't accept, that makes them seem more crazy. But by going through normalizing, maybe that brings them to a more culturally acceptable interpretation, and along with better ways of dealing with it. Now, I want to take a look at a slide. This is an illustration that Isabel Clarke uses in her groups in an acute care setting. She emphasizes that having unshared experiences is something common to all of us, that that's really something that we all have. And health isn't about getting rid of those wacky and wild internal experiences. We don't have to think of those kind of experiences as mad or wrong, but that we function best when we speak and interact from the intersection of our awareness of our personal experiences and our awareness of the larger cultural reality, or the cultural picture of reality, we might say, or the consensus reality. So if people can not fear their weird experiences and also not feel like they have to try to get rid of them, but also not overvalue them to the extent that they're just coming from those interpretations, but where they're kind of like being curious about how to fit it all together into one picture, kind of, or how to integrate that. And so it's important for the person to also integrate a sense of like, well, how do other people look at this, or what would be the consensus view, and not necessarily accepting that the consensus view is correct, because obviously it's not always correct. The cultural consensus sometimes is misguided, but it's really helpful to know what it is so that we can see how things might fit together. Basically, normalizing can help people come up with a more complex understanding of their experiences. Instead of thinking of their experiences as all bad, or sometimes actually run into people who think their experiences are all good and all perfectly true without ever questioning them, people can more easily reflect on the double-sided nature of their experiences. I think a simple example of that might be the person is having voices that they're feeling distressed about, and they're often distracting and obnoxious. But if the person also becomes more aware of how they're getting companionship from those voices at times, or maybe that the voices are serving functions like bringing up reminders of past traumas or internal conflicts that need additional attention, then they are more able to kind of like understand why the voices are there and find ways to deal with them, maybe take care of those needs in other ways, get more other kinds of companionship, find ways of dealing with those past traumas in a healthy way. so that they don't need the voices so much to bring those to their attention. And I'm going to get that into more in a future module on hearing voices and ways of coping with that. So when we're doing normalizing, we can also talk about how psychotic experiences are valued in many cultures. For example, within traditions like shamanism. Um, Though when we're doing that, it also helps to point out that within those traditions, there's usually a period of learning how to negotiate with the experiences successfully. Um, so for the experiences to really be valuable, often it's important that the person learn how not to be pushed around by them or get lost in them. And that's something we can talk about within normalizing. Another key point, I think, is that once the difficulties that we call psychosis are understood as variations in normal human experiences, um, and normal human difficulties, then openings are created for understanding how existing coping skills might be used to deal with them. So people end up feeling less helpless. For example, if people hear a critical voice and think that hearing that voice means they're crazy unless they can get rid of it, and then maybe, let's say, the drugs they're taking aren't working to stop the voice, they might feel really terrible, really stuck and hopeless. But if they can think of the voice as not all that much different from self-critical thoughts that everyone has, and if they can bring to bear the kind of coping strategies that they might otherwise use for self-critical thoughts, then they might actually feel life can go on even if the voices continue. And then there's also the possibility that once they're less freaked out by the voice itself will be more likely to fade away. And that brings us to one of the really key benefits of normalizing, which is that it brings more hope for recovery. Because if psychosis is seen more as just an extreme variation of everyday problems, then there's hope of making those problems a little less extreme, using coping methods and that, so that then once they become less extreme, people can get on with their lives and their valued activities. And that's really what we're wanting to help people accomplish.